Good evening and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Tuesday the 7th of September and this is Scotland at 7. I'm Andrew Wilson and this evening I'm hosting the programme from Edinburgh. First, we will look at today's coronavirus update, then I will introduce this evening's guest, and then we will discuss the stories behind today's main headline together. As of 2 p.m. today, since the start of the pandemic, a total of 2,875,491 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and the UK Government regional testing centres. Of these, 2,400,464 have been confirmed negative and 475,027 have tested positive. There are 5,692 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all those with symptoms will be tested. I'm sorry to say that there are 16 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 8,181. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test in the past 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 805 were in hospital last night, 77 of whom were in intensive care. And as of 8 a.m. this morning, 4,128,492 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,742,826 had received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures show that 133,483 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, and that's an increase of 209 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. And as it's Tuesday, we also have an update from the Office for National Statistics. In the week ending the 27th of August 2021, the COVID-19 infection rate in England was 1.41%, which is similar to the week before. The hospital admission rate decreased to 7.02 per 100,000 people in the week ending the 29th of August. There were 769 deaths involving coronavirus registered in the UK in the week ending the 27th of August. Of these, 649 were registered in England, 16 in Wales, 48 in Scotland, and 53 in Northern Ireland. The figures for England and Wales separately exclude deaths from non-residents, and therefore the sum may differ from the total UK figure. Now, this evening, we are lucky enough to be joined by Peter Curran. Peter was a personnel and HR professional with a number of very large corporations, and now that he is retired, he's a noted commentator and writer. Peter, thank you for joining us this evening on Scotland at 7. How are you this evening?
I'm well, I'm a little bit sniffly, so I apologise if I sneeze, but I'll do my best.
Not at all, Peter. It's great to see you, and we're very grateful to you for joining us. Today at Holyrood, the First Minister introduced her government's programme for government for 2021-2022, entitled A Fairer, Greener Scotland. Leading Scotland safely out of the pandemic, urgently confronting climate change, driving a green, fair economic recovery, and boosting opportunities for children and young people are among the core priorities in this year's programme for government, which was published today. The programme sets out plans for a record increase in frontline health spending, new legislation for a national care service, a system providing low-income families with free childcare before and after school and during holidays, and actions to drive forward Scotland's national mission to end child poverty. The programme also includes plans to help secure a just transition to net zero, creating opportunities for new, good and green jobs, making homes easier and greener to heat, and encouraging people to walk, wheel or cycle instead of driving. The programme introduces 12 planned bills and carries over a further 2 bills from the last Parliament, but the programme for government also sets out a range of policy areas in which the Scottish Government says that it will act in the coming year, and so this evening Peter and I will have a look at the various elements of the programme for government. So firstly, thinking of health and social care, Measures set out in the programme for government include increasing frontline health spending by 20%, leading to an increase of at least £2.5 billion by 2026-27, undertaking the biggest public service reform since the founding of the NHS, the creation of a national care service for Scotland, with legislation brought forward by June next year, improving national well-being with increased direct mental health investment of at least 25%, with £120 million this year to support the recovery and transformation of services, and investing £250 million to tackle the drugs death emergency over the next 5 years. So, Peter, thinking first of the policy area relating to health and social care, which of the announcements today what strikes you first about the package relating to health and social care that's been announced today?
Well, certainly I'm delighted about the intent that it reveals and the recognition of the priority of this. I mean, my wife and I have an interest in this, in that we have a relative, a contemporary in social care, in a private care home in Broxburn. And we've been through the whole bit from the initial diagnosis when she was at home, dealing with the police, dealing with the NHS formally, getting formal diagnosis, etc., through to evaluating care homes and the delights of power of attorney. Now, many families go through this, and ultimately, with luck, if we survive, but bad luck if it's done badly, all of us will have to face the possibility of care. So it's hard to single out any single measure. And talking about budgets, well, clearly they're never enough, but there is no infinite money tree, as we know. I hope due priority is given, and I know there's reference to it, to the training of care staff. I mean, there have been some examples where clearly there has been a failure of training, and training of staff is a critical area that's often overlooked. You know, the best people in the world, the most highly motivated people, with people with a real will to do good, nonetheless have to be given the crucial skills to do that. So I hope they can do that. I hope they can meet the funding needs. And I hope they can project in advance rather than find out by hard, painful mistakes, perhaps were before, and deal with them. But I'd be hard put to single out a particular area and say that impressed more than any other. I'm just delighted that they're doing it.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, you touched there on the provision of care, both for our more senior citizens, but of course the care service provides care for citizens of all ages. So,
Absolutely.
thinking for a moment about the proposed creation of a new national care service, what would you like to see as the priorities for a new national care service?
Well, a natural instinct as a parent, a grandparent, and a great-grandparent is to say, focus on the young. But that would be unfair in a sense, and perhaps in my earlier comments I was reflecting my own experiences, my own priorities. I think it's very important that we have to have, for lack of a better word, a despair index. I mean, the harrowing stories which sometimes get presented, always after the event, always after something's gone wrong, of people saying that the way their lives have been crushed, their spirits have been crushed by the inadequacies of the system. We somehow have to get our early warning systems. Politicians in general are very bad at looking ahead. The very nature of their role makes them look on the immediate implications of publicity, finance. But somebody has to, I've used the metaphor many times before, I won't do it to death again, of the helicopter. They've got to get above the ground and see what's coming at them. So I hope they can examine scenarios. I mean, in business, the thing I found invaluable was to say, well, we're going into this complex, large area. Let's posit a few scenarios. What if this? Let's set up this little scenario. People have to jump ahead of the game. And it's in the constructive dialogue from that between a concerned mix of people that produces results. There's a concept in American television production, especially comedy series or situation comedies, all of which are produced not by a single brilliant writer or a brilliant twosome, but by a group working together. And they have a complementary term that they apply to people who the team thinks is effective. They're good in the room. And this is what we have to find. And if we haven't got them, we have to train them in these techniques. People have to be good at working in interdisciplinary teams and listening and lifting, if there's a chairperson, lifting themselves out of their own personal expertise area and discipline and opening out to the perspective of other areas. That's where I think successful, caring politics that's the area it should inhabit if it's going to make effective use of the money. And for God's sake, don't build a bureaucracy, and please don't make appointments on the basis of patronage or because somebody had been a supporter of something or stuffed an envelope or made a donation. I know the Scottish government doesn't display the level of political corruption that the UK government does, but like all political parties, there's a tendency to reward their friends. All I would say is don't reward your friends if they're assholes. Find some other way of rewarding them.
Absolutely, Peter. Thank you. And it's interesting that you mentioned Westminster there, because, of course, today's big announcement in Westminster also related to funding social care in England. And I was wondering what your thoughts were in comparing or contrasting the announcements relating to social care in Scotland today with those that we heard from Westminster also.
Well, unusually, I'm reluctant to be too critical of Westminster, especially at this present time, not on a political basis. The fact is, bad, good, and different, and Boris's government is bad, a big B. They nonetheless are facing an unprecedented challenge. And I don't accept, as some extreme opponents of the argument are, that every is evil and every Tory supporter is evil because of it. That's evidently nonsense. There's a lot of people in the Tory party, in the politicians in the party and in the support at large, who are good human people who happen to share a different political perspective of society than mine. I think that what's the key difference? I'd be hard put to put something on it. It seems to me that the Scottish programme was much more focused and practical and identified a series of it. Whereas Boris, although he tried to avoid it today, what I saw of him, didn't lapse into the vague statements. I thought Keir Starmer was best moderately effective, at least by his standards, but there's a aching gap on what the opposition would do differently. So I have to wish them well. I mean, the bulk of my family is in England, and they will receive their care from that. In fact, 3 members of them are in significant medical care at the moment. So I don't want to be negative about it, nor do I want to make political points, but I do think from what I've seen of both, that ours was, in the sense of Scotland and Nicola's announcement, were better structured, better in intent. At the end of the day, there's no prizes for setting ambitious targets. There's no prizes for promising to do something. You judge the tree by its fruit, not by what you say is going to appear on the branch when spring comes.
That's a very fair point, Peter, and it's and I think nobody would disagree that the provision of the reorganisation and funding of the provision of social care in England has been a priority for governments for many years, and successive governments in Westminster have successfully dodged the issue. So I completely agree that at least it's now being tackled. One other area of contrast between Westminster and Scotland struck me as well in this context. We were mentioning the £250 million to tackle the drugs death emergency in Scotland over the next 5 years. And of course, we know that there is conflict between Westminster and Holyrood with regard to the policies and the implementation of a public health approach to the drugs death emergency. Do you think that the contrast we see in the approaches to social care are going to be reflected in in the differences between the approach to the drugs death emergency? Do you think Westminster is going to stick to its guns and refuse to allow the Scottish Government to pursue the approaches it wants to approach?
I'm afraid the answer to that last part is yes. I do think they'll refuse it. The thing that has always bedeviled the drug approach across all the nations, at least of the Western world, is the whole discussion and analysis is poisoned by a sort of belief system, a belief about the very nature of drugs and whether the responsibility lies with the individual or outside of the individual. The whole aspect of decriminalisation rests on this and this morality. Now, I'm all in favour of morality in the sense of ethics and personal standards and what we regard as the core elements of human values. But when it narrows down to things being claimed as morally valid, I think there's a whole lot of people, quite frankly, share the view that drug addicts have only themselves to blame, their families have only themselves to blame for encouraging them or trying to help them. The medical profession shouldn't waste their energy on these people. And repression and control measures are the necessary thing. I mean, the whole dialogue, it's almost like the idea that all our prisoners go in and bask in the glory with coloured television and handmaidens to wash their feet and enjoy the delights of prison till they can get out and resume a life of crime. People that have that mindset, it seems to be independent of their intelligence. I don't know where it comes from. It's a sort of Old Testament morality. Cut off their hands or whatever other aspect of their anatomy is making them do this. I'm a good law-abiding, God-fearing person. I don't do things like that. Why should we benefit other people? I think that whole thing infects the debate. And it's still there. I mean, scratch the surface in any debate, and sooner or later this pops up. I know that's maybe an unusual perspective of it, but it's one that I very deeply feel over a long number of years watching this unfold in America, on the continent, and here. I mean, the society now, the society I grew up in, has been transformed in an appalling way by drugs. I mean, drink was always a problem in Scotland, and drugs were there, but they're a very remote concept. The level of violence, the huge money involved in it, it's distorted our whole society, and a large part of that is the nature of the moralistic views brought to bear on the criminalised, decriminalised question. It's a big question, I know it is, very difficult one to answer and take absolute positions in. Somehow we have to come off this moral platform, and I have to say the forces of religion in the main have not been positive at all in this area.
That's a very fair point, Peter. Thank you. Now, we've looked at social care, and as I said, I'm not forgetting that social care is delivered to folks of all ages, not only to our more senior citizens. But we'll move now to look at some of the steps which have been announced to address some of the systemic poverty and inequality which we see in Scotland at the moment. Firstly, the programme from government, which was announced by the First Minister this afternoon, sets out the following topics. Firstly, expanding the Scottish Child Payment to under 16s by the end of next year, and doubling it to £20 a week as soon as possible after that, with a £520 bridging payment given to every child who is in receipt of free school meals this year. Investing a further £1 billion to tackle the poverty-related attainment gap, and providing councils with funding to recruit 3,500 additional teachers and 500 additional classroom assistants. Providing free childcare to low-income families before and after school and during holidays, and expanding free early learning and childcare to 1- and 2-year-olds. Investing £100 million over the next 3 years to support frontline services for preventing violence against women and girls, and delivering a revolution in children's rights, including across the justice system. So, Peter, looking now at this particular policy area, and in particular tackling poverty in Scotland, do you think that this part of the programme goes far enough?
Again, at the risk of repeating myself across many programs on this, you can never go far enough. I mean, any basic university course on basic ethics shows that choices have to be made, resources are limited. But we're faced with an appalling fact that choices are made and they're the wrong choices at the massive level. I'm talking about things like nuclear weapons and the huge amount of money that is siphoned away to people who already are rolling in it. So it's never enough. But across the range of policies here and what they're trying to do, bearing in mind that Nicola is facing exactly the same in a different nation and a different scale, the financial impacts of the pandemic. I mean, simply to get back to where we were financially and our ability to fund care and do all of these things. But again, there isn't the magic money tree. What there is the magic shift of priorities tree. So we have to shift money to where it's due. Can I say that you can't expect that everybody has experienced poverty, but I have experienced real poverty of a kind that many people in politics never have. And I'm sure so it'd have to be of my age to experience the kind of grinding, single widowed mother poverty that I experienced in Glasgow, and even more extreme poverty experienced by my classmates in the Carlton in Glasgow. Once you've had that, it's viscerally embedded in you, the sheer injustice of it and the sheer inability of people to express that injustice in a constructive way. So somehow we have to get the will-to-do to say, somewhere along the line, it's all very well having good intention, but somewhere along the line, you have to accept an subtraction from your standard of living. And none of these arguments that I made my way, I experienced, I've done well, we have to accept, I'm not a well-off man in particular. I'm what used to be described as comfortable. But I would happily accept a reduction in my style of living, which is not extravagant. I'm not a big continental holiday goer. I don't run a car. But I would accept that I should pay more tax and that I should cut back on my aspirations in certain areas and not indulge myself. And we'll never get to the state of morality when every time you order a pint, you say that's £4 not in the child at the pocket of some mothers struggling to feed their children. But somehow we've got to use the phrase now, shift the optic radically. We're not going to come out of this without sacrifice. And that's only on the economic hit of the pandemic. COP26 is coming up, and the economic hit to achieve net zero within any of the targets is going to be enormous as well. We are not going to be able to have the 2 holidays and a couple of £100 at a pop concert and all the horrific extravagances that are permitted by people who are filthy rich, and I use the adjective advisedly, obscenely rich. These people must be made to pay.
Thank you, Peter. I'm thinking also in the context here in particular, you've been discussing in particular your experiences in the Carlton in Glasgow. And this week we have had further confirmation that at the end of this month, Westminster will take back the increase in universal credit, costing our poorest citizens more than £1,000 a year. With Westminster seemingly trying to make the position of the poorest in our society worse, and the Scottish Government apparently trying to make things better, what's going to give politically?
Well, I hope what's going to give politically is the union. Because the fact is, by any objective standards, any historical measures, ancient or modern, it's the union that is pulling us down. It's not just the union in terms of financial and economic theories and structures. It's the union in terms of its social expectancies and the grossly lopsided nation that we have. What's good? Oh, well, where do you start? I mean, The Tories deny this, but the evidence points inexorably to one thing. The Tories' policy is to make the rich richer and make the poor pay for it by whatever means. And until we won't wipe out Tories in Scotland. I hope not. I've got many friends, former colleagues, people I like and respect dearly, who are Scottish Tories, but Scottish Tories in the sense of an economic view of the relative freedom that's permitted in a society. I can handle that as a dichotomy, something for debate. But the kind of Toryism that's manifested itself in its worst birth so far through Brexit and Boris, and it's working class Toryism as well. It's alien to the fundamental Scottish character. And there is such a thing as the Scottish character. There's also such a thing as people who come to us from another nation, another place entirely in terms of ethnic background, who have what I call the Scottish character. Because the Scottish, I'm not arguing exceptionalism, but I'm saying there is an element in the best of the Scottish character, and God knows there's a worst of it, which has the right values. I was brought up as a Roman Catholic, but I have to say that the values that I admire most in society and did all my life were the Presbyterian values. Not because of God, I never accepted a belief in a God, but because of the recognition of the paramount nature of the individual in our society, and the right individual, and the brotherhood of the individuals communicating freely. I didn't want to preach, but it's easy to go into dry as dust statistics. This is about real people. This is about blood and guts and pain and misery and failure, which doesn't have to be there. We have all the tools in this world to do it right, and we've got to do it right.
Thanks, Peter. And finally, in the context of this area of the government policy set out in the programme for government earlier today, do you think that there will be a revolution in children's rights, especially when Westminster is taking the Scottish Government to court to stop the introduction of the UN Charter on Children's Rights into Scots law?
Well, law comes up all the time. And everybody, we must live by a rule of law. All civilized societies live by a rule of law. But the law, you would like to think that the law is a vehicle for delivering justice, but it's not. The law is simply a system. It's a set of procedures. Along the line, if the values applied to the rule of law by the lawmakers, the lawgivers, the people who interpret the law, and the people who enforce the law, if that comes through, then the law can produce justice. But I worry about this constant dependency of Scotland, not within the context of being a prisoner of the Union, the dependency in the mind even of our politicians, that the only way to resolve anything is by the use of what is essentially the Union law. We have Scottish law, and that Scottish law is based on Roman law, and there are values embodied in it. Some lawyers might argue that point, I don't know. We have to assert ourselves. We have to say at a certain point, we will assert what we see as Scottish values and Scottish law, even if it runs contrary to the law of the Union, which is impinging on and is enforced in Scotland. We have to challenge. And we've shown that the law is relatively powerless when it comes to a massive outpouring of public anger against an unjust law. Only got to look at the fate of the poll tax in Scotland. There's some of the politicians most in the forefront of that, and who I admired, and I'll point to one that everybody will squeal horror. I admired Tommy Sheridan's role in opposing the polls, and we needed a politician for that. What came after is another story. The people that knew Tommy are polarised, and I'm not arguing anything for the current state. We need that spirit of resistance. That this we will not tolerate. We don't get, not in breach of the law, not in breach of the principle of law, but asserting the spirit that lies behind the law in any just nation. So I worry about the legality. I put no faith on Boris' influence, as he must influence the law of, I'll call it the law of England, not being anti-English, but there is effectively two laws. I hold no hope for anything in recourse. If we could do it by that legally, yes, it would be very nice. But sooner or later, we're going to have to get off our asses and say, we won't tolerate this.
Absolutely. Thanks, Peter. After the Butte House Agreement bringing the Greens into the Scottish Government, and with COP26 getting closer by the day, one might expect a lot of policies aimed at the climate crisis and its effects. And so in the programme for government announced today, we have the following: providing £1.8 billion to make homes easier and greener to heat as part of a commitment to decarbonise 1 million homes by 2030, ensuring that at least 10% of the total transport budget goes on active travel by 2024-25, helping more people to cycle, wheel or walk instead of drive. Supporting a just transition to a low-carbon economy for people and businesses, including a £500 million Just Transition Fund for the North East and Morayshire. Investing an additional £500 million to support the new good and green jobs of the future, including by helping people to access training. And delivering 110,000 affordable homes by 2032, and investing an additional £50 million to tackle homelessness and rough sleeping. So, Peter, at the risk of repeating myself, perhaps the same question, do you think that this aspect of the programme for government goes far enough today?
I think in terms of its aspirations, as far as it could in the present context. I mean, quite frankly, there's an old law of targeting. How do you set targets? Any fool can set unrealizable targets. I say today that the United States will be on landing in early '69. Will land on the moon a month from now. Any fool can do that. It's just not possible. So the maxim for setting targets and therefore setting budgets, therefore setting programs for government has always got to be ambitious but realistic. Under extreme crisis like a war or a pandemic, as we've shown recently, that we can, as a people, as a nation, as two nations, as four nations, behave very radically when push comes to shove. But somehow we have to be able to behave radically on things that matter fundamentally before the point that push comes to shove. What can I say about it? Say that we decided that we were going to put a radical target on one aspect of that. The question that always has to be asked, Nicola asked it in almost every FMQs I've ever seen of Labour or the Tories. You're demanding that we perform these wonders. What are we going to sacrifice from a finite budget to do it? But negotiation contains the concept of the zero-sum game and the distributive bargain. The zero-sum game says, here is a pot of gold of 100 pieces of 8. We have to reach an agreement to divide it between us or there'll be conflict and we'll all be in trouble. But whatever you get that's more than half the pot, the other party loses. That's what's called a zero-sum game. When the distribution is done, there's nothing left. The key concept, which has built companies, corporations, nations, universities, is the concept of distributive bargain, that by coming together, facing what looks like a finite pot, by our intelligent behaviour, we can make that pot bigger for all. And instead of the win-lose, lose-win outcomes of many arguments, debates, and deals, you have what's called the win-win, that both parties depart feeling satisfied. So I can say no more about that than prospects for God. Be ambitious, but for God's sake, be realistic. There are no prizes for setting targets that you can't achieve. There is, I have to say, with the SNP, and they're not alone in this, but we are in Scotland after all. The SNP, there's an element of being under targets and falling back in admiration at how ambitious their own targets are. Look at the ambitious targets we've set. But then they very rapidly have to develop another skill, which is how do we apologize and justify ourselves for not achieving these targets? And they then want prizes for being open and genuine and contrite. There are no prizes for being open, genuine, and contrite or setting well targets. There's only prizes for results, and governments have to be judged on that. So priority setting is a skill that can be said. There's no absolutes in it, but people need to get their thinking straight in better order about how decisions are made, how decisions are factored. Somehow we have to push what seems an arcane science down into the wider mind of politicians and indeed into the population and the electorate. I don't know if any of that made any sense.
No, Peter, absolutely. Thank you. You and I touched on training a little bit earlier on in the programme, and in this part of the programme for government, as I say, we see supporting a just transition to a low carbon economy with a £500 million just transition fund for the North East and Morayshire, an additional £500 million to support the new green good jobs of the future, including by helping people access training. Where would you like to see training and investment in training focused most?
Well, if we look at some of the big crucial areas in public services, I don't think we've got anything to say other than that medical training has always been very, very rigorous. I mean, you don't get to be a doctor or a qualified nurse, surgeon, or a high-level technician in the NHS without gone through rigorous training, and therefore funds have to be pumped certainly to help training, but the training and the expertise is right. I made my living in the training game from 1988 till around 2003. I was actually selling myself as a trainer and a consultant, and I inhabited a world of other trainers. And there is a rotten core to a large section of the world. There are people who lobby government to make a priority of certain things, to emphasize the training aspect of it, who then rapidly set up training companies who spout the most appalling bilge to people. And patronage debts are satisfied by government, as we saw with the protection equipment during the pandemic, and people being made rich overnight because the government they were making tin cans for somebody, and somebody said, "Can you make masks?" And suddenly they were in the game. They may have filled some of the need, but I think probably didn't fill the majority. People have to have a very hard beady eye. I mean, there's a group of trainers and training organizations. What names I'm very aware of, the learned friends, and what can happen if you get it. And they're nothing but a scam. They're like some kind of training Ponzi scheme, where one individual commits to delivering. The politician falls back in relief and says, "Oh, that's got that responsibility off my back. I've given it to John so-and-so, and by the way, he may give me a knighthood somewhere along the way," etc. And that person then goes out and hires a number of people. Short anecdote in this, I'll keep it short. The training game, I was approached by a very large international consultancy working across the globe. I better not go into too much detail, identifiable. And they say, "We have major programs going to major organizations. We're going to cascade them down the organization." Now, the idea of a training cascade is music to the ears of a trainer, because it means you start at the top and then you've got loads of work as you fan down the pyramid. And I said, "What's it about?" And I'll make up something ridiculous, but they said, "We want to teach people ways of tweaking their ears that will magically improve their productivity." And we won't call it the ear tweaking program, a grandiose name. And I said, I know nothing about ear tweaking or these theories. No bother, come along and we will train you. And I went to a place in London, a lot of people like me, trainers from a wide range, and they said, let us show you our methodology. And they gave us this superficial methodology. And we were then to go out and deliver it. But there's a little codicil to this introduction. They said, by the way, when you visit the company, they will say to you, how long have you been with this company? And how deep is your expertise in this area? And you must avoid asking these questions at all. You must always say, well, the organization of which I am a part has done this research and that research, and the organization of which I am a part has done this across the globe. And if they press too hard, make an excuse, say you thought you heard your phone ringing, or you have to go to the loo, or leave the tape. But do not answer the question by saying, I came to a seminar last week where I was given a rudimentary instruction in some very doubtful methodology and told that I was going to deliver it. There's loads of that about, and government are suckers for it. There's a kings, queens, the whole royal family ransom going down the chunky in that kind of training. It's
Absolutely.
bad.
Thanks, Peter. I knew you'd have an opinion on training in particular. Now, Peter, you live in a part of
An opinion on
Peter,
everything. Someone will know what is done.
of course. Now, Peter, you live in a part of Edinburgh where what is now called active travel became controversial, as some local politicians objected to measures to reduce car traffic and to increase walking and cycling. So why do you think local politicians and national politicians oppose active travel measures like this? Do you think, can they just not go a bike?
I've tried, believe me, especially for the last 10 or 12 years in its activism, to get inside the heads of politicians. And I found it very difficult. It's easy to get inside their wallets, and you know what's motivating their wallet, but getting inside their heads is a different matter. They can't all be fronts for the car industry or determined to maximise the extraction of fossil fuels. They can't all be the tools of some big international oil companies. For God's sake, try and get people off bikes. Bikes don't burn any fossil fuels and they don't have large margin. Why do they do this? In some cases, I think they have genuine beliefs, which may err on the side of what I call BAM pottery. But everybody's got a BAM pot idea somewhere along the line. You know, wind is trees waving their branches. How do you know? Well, every time it's windy, the trees are waving their branches. I don't know why they do that, quite frankly. I think active travel makes sense, and I don't know why they're opposed. I really don't.
Thanks, Peter. And finally, in this area, do you think is £50 million enough to end involuntary rough sleeping in Scotland's streets? After all, we saw rough sleeping stopped in the blink of an eye at the start of the pandemic.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I'd hate to see us go back to the old methodology, which I think we invented. I thought maybe we'd imported it from America, where the local police found their local beggars and put them in a one-way ticket in a bus to Togo somewhere and hope that they wouldn't come back and bother the city again. That ended it pretty damn quick for a period. Rough sleeping is a tragedy. And, well, like Linda will tell you this. Linda and I, a couple of times when I was broadcasting Scotland, we walked up, down, or up into the town, depending on how you view it. And she knows I'm a sucker for a beggar. I mean, I cannot pass a beggar. And somebody, it wasn't Linda, somebody who was with us said, that guy sitting with a bottle of Buckfast by his side. I said, well, if I had to sleep under newspapers on a freezing cold night in a lane in Glasgow, I'd have a bottle of Buckfast by my side as well. So I can't be moralistic about these things. Nobody does that by choice. No, they've either got mental problems or they've got health problems, or they simply have got in a rough groove, and that's frighteningly easy. I look back at people throughout my life who had the same upbringing as me, and some managed to get through it, partly by luck, a lot of it by bloody hard work, but others didn't. And there was nothing morally deficient in them. Some of them were just sheer lady luck had decided that they were not going to smile on these people. So all I would say is with shelter, I say it's an abomination. People should not be sleeping on the streets, except as a
Absolutely.
demonstration of it. It's bad to sleep on the streets.
Absolutely. Thank you, Peter. Now we'll move to the final area of today's programme for government, and it won't surprise you that we'll discuss this at length. And it was introduced today as follows: taking forward the democratic mandate for a referendum on independence to be held within this Parliament and, if the COVID crisis is over, within the first half of this Parliament, while providing the people of Scotland with the information they need to make an informed choice on their future. Now, addressing the Scottish Parliament, the First Minister said that work will now restart on the detailed prospectus that will guide the decision. She said, as we emerge from the pandemic, choices fall to be made that will shape our economy and our society for decades to come. Which Parliament, Westminster or Holyrood, should make these choices, and what principles will they be guided by? These are the questions which cannot be avoided nor postponed until the die is already cast, so we intend to offer the choice. We will do so only when the COVID crisis is past, but our aim, COVID permitting, is that it will be the first half of this Parliament before the end of 2023. And crucially, we will ensure that the choice when it does come is a fully informed one. The case for independence is a strong one, and we will present it openly, frankly, and with confidence and ambition. So, Peter, what's your initial reaction to the way in which the First Minister positioned her plans for the next independence referendum?
Well, other than the mention of 2023, while I share all of the aspirations and the definition of what needs to be done, it comes dangerously close to being what I call a motherhood statement. I mean, anybody at any month in any year back to 2007 beyond could have made statements like that. Big question in my mind, when the pandemic ends, how is anybody going to determine when the pandemic ends? By what measures, by what criteria, by what consensus, who is going to do it? This is not like VE Day or VJ Day, the end of the war in Europe after the Second, or the end of the war in Japan in the Pacific, where you can say, at this point, the war ended. There was an armistice, a truce, or no armistice in World War II. It was clear victory. What are we going to do? The other concept that bugs me is this idea of work has stopped during the pandemic. Well, if work stopped, it only stopped among the paid advisors and politicians controlled by the Scottish Government. It sure as hell didn't stop among Commonweal, Indie Live, AUOB. It didn't stop Casting Scotland. You may say we didn't have big decisions to make in relation to the pandemic, but I do not believe one minute that every one of the SNP civil servants, every one of the MSPs, every one of the MPs in Parliament, every one of the special advisors was so consumed by work on the pandemic that they didn't have time to budget on essentials that were inevitably going to bulk large in our economic recovery, our survival, and indeed in COP26. So that statement jarred with me. It brought me to a shuddering halt. I don't like it. Why did the work stop? The work should never have stopped from the day after September the 18th, 2014, when we knew we just lost the referendum. The work should have continued, invigorated, and should never have stopped. Somebody should have been taken and say, the pandemic we'll get through that without you. Your job is to do this. I mean, just just back up with me. But I like the fact that at least there's an explicit commitment of a sort, and as always, we'll judge the tree by its fruit. This pandemic may never end. We may be left with the equivalent of something like flu as it emerged in its extreme fashion back in 1918. And is with us still. We still go for our flu jab. But the nature of this COVID variant is such that we may not yet have entered the real pandemic, but the world of government and social action and political action cannot stop because of something like that. I mean, have they no concept of parallel processing, of division of responsibility? Everybody is working a referendum stop with a pandemic with a capital B.
Thanks, Peter. With that in mind, do you think the Scottish Government is now making the case strongly enough that the route to a better society for everyone after COVID is through independence from Westminster?
Well, strongly in the sense of big words. Yeah, this is important. In terms of coming to grips with the practicalities, no. I think a whole series of some straightforward questions that you can guarantee you will cause any SNP politician, certainly any cabinet member, to run a mile if they're asked them. And a very simple question, I'm not going to rehearse them all here tonight, but no, I don't think there's a clarity of vision of the sequence of events. The campaign, what that campaign says, what it says about the nature of political parties, what it says about the nature of the future of Scotland, what it cannot, and it's impossible for it to say about the nature of the future of Scotland in certain key events, because we don't know the composition of the Scottish Parliament that will be elected at some point. How are the transitional arrangements going to be handled? Is there going to be a transitional government, which would be the sitting SNP government? Will they run to term? Will they not run to term? Should there be some form of coalition transitional government at that time? What are the role of the unionists who up to that point have been in opposition? Are they going to be excluded and sent into the outer darkness and there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth? Are they going to be accepted as fellow Scots with certain different views on economy and social measures who must be incorporated into a million questions they're not answering? And I have to say, who in the party visibly has the capacity to answer these questions? Where is the intellect? I'm sure it's there. Where the hell is it? What's keeping it from expressing itself articulately? Certainly not articulately enough for me.
I understand. Thank you, Peter. Now, having a look at the various elements of the programme for government that we've been discussing across social care, dealing with poverty, the green agenda, and confirming the outline plans for the next independence referendum for Scotland, reflecting across all of those elements of the programme for government announced today, what stands out for you now that we've had a chance to talk about them?
You'd have to rehearse for me some of the elements. I'm brain dead after that orgy of passion on various things. So give me a few labels to talk to.
Of course, no. So we discussed firstly we discussed health and social care, including increasing frontline health spending and introducing beginning the process of introducing.
We're talking about COP26. I missed the point here.
So, in terms of having looked at all of the areas of the programme for government that was announced today by the First Minister, across social care, across addressing inequality, across the green agenda, and across the announcement of the high-level plan and the intention to hold the next independence referendum for Scotland by the end of 2023, looking across all the various elements of the programme for government that were announced today, on reflection, what are the standout elements for you?
The standout elements were care of the elderly, care of poverty-stricken children and adults who are caught in some kind of financial vice that they're in. And I suppose, yes, the statements on the referendum, and really, that's about it. The COP, what can we say about our involvement in COP? I don't know that. I'm not entirely clear yet exactly what our involvement will be. Are we going to have some kind of a presence or not? I may have missed this. I mean, I try to keep up with a broad range of views, but I have my sort of focused interest. And again, back to the budgeting thing, if you're doing that, you're not doing something else. But yeah, I think the focus on care, what has been said at least about intent in the referendum, and the green approach would seem to me to be the essential. Not a dicky word about nuclear weapons unless I've missed it, other than maybe a generalised statement.
Yes, no, I think the programme for government today that the First Minister announced related to matters that are within the control of the Scottish Government. And I don't think the programme for government strayed into areas that are clearly reserved to Westminster. And so I suspect that's the reason why there was no discussion in the programme for government by the Scottish Government of matters that are that are reserved to Westminster. I suspect that's probably the explanation why.
That's a fair point, Andrew, although I wish they would stray into areas that are none of their business. That's what independence movements do. And I'd like to see,
of course.
But perhaps it would be a mandatory doing if they haven't caught up with iPlayer of the first 3 episodes of Vigil. I'm not saying it's necessarily a realistic view of what goes on in nuclear subs, but there are 4 nightmare vessels patrolling the globe 24 hours a day, capable of destroying millions of people in a large chunk of the planet and the environment. And if what goes on in them is any guide, accepting it's fiction and brilliantly done, we recognise the fact that we have fallible human beings in an unnatural, compressed environment with a variety of political and ethical backgrounds. Carrying weapons can reduce us to the Stone Age or beyond.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks, Peter. And that is the news in Scotland at 7 this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, and we would like you to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland, and you will find the link to do that on the screen now. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work and promotes the station, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be here tomorrow at 7 o'clock with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us then. I'd like to say very many thanks to Peter for joining us this evening and for sharing his thoughts and his wisdom and his experience. So that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. Thank you for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland. I hope that you have a very peaceful evening.